Review a design. In this video, we'll use inspection tools and we'll identify mass properties. In Fusion 360, we want to get started with the performance and weight reduction.f3d dataset. This dataset contains a motorcycle with a generative frame, and our task is to create a generative swing arm. If we take a look at this design, you'll notice that pretty much everything except for the frame is still in the default steel gray material. So the first step in the process is for us to go to Inspect and turn on Component Color Cycling. This will make it a bit easier for us to identify the different components in the design. Oftentimes when you have an assembly that has a large number of components, you'll get situations where there are very similar colors on components that are close to each other. If this is the case, we can always take a look at changing those colors. And first we're going to go to our rear wheel, we're going to right click, and we're going to cycle the component color. As we do this, it's going to simply go through the list of colors available, and it's going to keep cycling those colors until it gets to the next available color. We can drill down a bit further. For example, if we want to focus on just the tire, we can cycle the component color until we're happy with the color, and that way we can quickly and easily differentiate between different components in a design. There's obviously a lot in this design, and we're going to have to make sure that we understand the components that are needed and the areas in which we have to build. We're going to have to avoid things like the coil spring and portions of the linkage while creating obstacles and preserves. We also need to maintain the axle blocks and move around the rear brake as well as the tire and rim. We're going to be mounting to the engine itself at this pivot point, so it gives us a good idea in the space that we have to work with. But because of this, we also want to make sure that we understand a few other key elements. First, let's identify the entire weight of the rear wheel. To do this, we can right-click on the rear wheel. We can take a look at its properties. When we look at the properties of the rear wheel, there are a few things that we want to pay attention to. First, we'll note that the entire rear wheel subassembly, the material is set as steel. If we expand the physical properties, you can see that the mass is relatively large. This equates to roughly about 80 pounds, which is way more than we would expect. If we expand the rear wheel and we take a look at the rear rim, for example, and we right-click and take a look at its properties, we can see that the material is still steel, and when we take a look at the physical properties, again, we can see that it's a relatively large number. And this is common when we have designs that are handed to us and having all of those default materials. Obviously, when we don't have component color cycling on, we can see the gray material, which gives us a hint as to what the material is for all of our components. But in order to get accurate mass, you want to make sure that you are using the correct materials. For example, for the rear rim, we can right-click and change the physical material. In this case, we want to use a metal material, and we're going to go to an aluminum. I'm going to simply use the default aluminum as the mass properties are similar across all of the aluminums inside of Fusion 360. There are some exceptions, but this will give us a better idea. From here, if we take a look at the physical properties, we can see that we've dropped from about 788 ounces to 271. This is a drastic difference, which will make a big change in the overall mass. Ultimately, for this assembly, we're going to be looking at roughly about 50 pounds, including the rim and the tire, and this is a worst-case scenario. Ideally, it would be closer to about 15 to 25 pounds. But it's good to understand the components that you're dealing with and their masses, as it might come up when we're setting up our generative design study. At this point, it's a good idea for you to continue to investigate this assembly. Make sure you understand and identify several of the components that we're going to have to be working around before we get into our generative study setup. If you make any changes, make sure that you do save the design before moving on.